Hey, everybody. Um, so my name is Mark. I'm from Havas in New York. Global Director of Cognitive, so everything machine learning and AI. And I'm going to let everybody here introduce themselves, but we want this to be pretty conversational, so we're going to make sure to save time at the end for any questions from you guys. Why don't we start with Lauren?
Hi, I'm Lauren von Dehsen. I work at Nest and I lead the HVAC energy team as well as the safety team for all UX, so user experience, which includes things like the learning thermostat, the smoke detector, and energy programs as well as insurance partner programs.
Awesome. I'm Christian Guirnalda. I'm the Director of Open Innovation at Verizon, previously of Verizon Ventures, our VC arm. At Open Innovation, we look at partnering with universities and academia on joint R&D projects, as well as the startup ecosystem.
Hi, I'm Tim Allen. I'm a partner at Microsoft. I head up Fluent design system across all of our hardware and software, as well as the inclusive design team.
So I'm sure everybody here, we've spent the past day and a half basically talking all about AI and machine learning and all of those other buzzwords that we hear every day. So what I wanted to actually start off doing here is just go really quick, kind of like a lightning round style from everybody who's on stage with me, and actually have you guys define what do you think actual AI is, and really quickly, what is it and what is it not for everybody in the audience, because I think there's probably some misconceptions out there.
So for me, obviously Nest, it's a very core tenet of what we do. I think AI means learning in a way that helps and provides utility to people, in a way that you can sort of get ahead of them and understand what they're thinking and anticipate their needs.
It's exactly that. It's a buzzword, right? How do you really define the meaning of life or cloud? You got to have a definition for yourself. For us, it's about defining what the business value is first. So what are we trying to go and solve for? And how can we use data to ultimately get to that solution? And you think about it in 3 different levels, right? So the programming around feature design and use cases, and the sort of interplay between what people and brains need to go and do to build those features, how that ultimately goes and levels up to machine learning and ultimately deep learning after that. So it's the back and forth between those 3 layers around a business objective and getting to that solution.
I think it's the largest opportunity in recent history for technology to adapt to human beings rather than human beings adapting to technology. So at Microsoft, we're trying to empower 7.4 billion people around the world to achieve more. And that means sort of more value, greater access to great technology.
So Christian, you talked a little bit about like business value there. So let's talk a little bit about the business value when you have to convince internal stakeholders and external stakeholders who may or may not be savvy at all, or have some of these misconceptions around AI. Like, how are you actually communicating to them? Like, if you have to go to your CEO or CMO, how are you communicating to them and talking to them about why these solutions are valuable?
It comes so internally within a big company, and it's Verizon and other places as well. It's trying to figure out what's the objective of that executive that you're trying to convince that AI is the answer for. And so you start with what is ultimately going to move the needle for what their business goals are, and then figure out, okay, how can I then layer in different AI solutions to solve that? And so it's less about, hey, there's a hammer, let's go find a nail to go and hit. It's more, let me understand within the organization the problem that we have to go and solve for, and let's find the right way to tell a narrative on how big data, AI, machine learning can go and actually achieve those and sort of humanize it to the end consumer and business owner.
Tim?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's all about sort of the second part of that is people. You have the business strategy and how it's going to sort of impact the bottom line, but then you also, like you said at the end there, you have to understand the people that it's going to affect as well. What's their sort of context, what's their motivation, what's common across sort of all of humanity, but then also what's specific to the group of people that you're trying to target.
And I might add to that, one of the best ways to do exactly that is to visualize that. Like, how do you take take it from a PowerPoint slide or an Excel sheet and put it in front of that executive to show, here's the magical moment that that end user, that consumer will see, and then you get people excited about it within the company to go and follow up and ultimately bring it to life.
Lauren?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. The thing, in my particular case, right, the entire company is already living and breathing it. And so the selling isn't as heavy, you know. It's more about like what's the right thing to go put it against, and what's the next problem that we can solve, and are we really solving something that's adding and moving us in the right direction? So the conversation for us is a little shifted in that it's often more about which of these solutions. It's not. No, not the technology, the solution, you know. So I have it kind of good in that way.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're all talking about making it tangible as well when you're selling something in. But I think AI is different because I think the old ways of testing theories may not apply. It's in terms of focus groups and so forth. Like, you're not going to be able to. It's going to be more difficult to get people to tell you what they want or what they need, and it's more inventive necessarily. So there's different approaches to be able to sell that type of sort of tangible value in.
So I mean, you guys are making me kind of think a little bit about just like the aspect of designing and prototyping with AI systems. Like, is it something that you guys are actively doing in regards for internal stakeholder readouts or for external stakeholder readouts? And how are you actually, like, what's the ROI on doing that? And how are you even like measuring success of those things? Christian, you want to?
So, I mean, how many different bot companies to help you build your bot are there out there in the market? If you had a nickel for everyone that launched every week, you'd have a lot of nickels in a pile on your desk. But it's super easy for companies to quickly come up with what these prototypes are to show some of the different features that are out there. Then you sort of get the devil in the detail of, oh, is there data that we have access to that can help power this and make it work? So in terms of time to show use case, it's pretty short. You can get something decently tangible, but in terms of time to training on internal data or external data and bringing it apples to actually make the thing production ready, it's a different conversation.
Tim, you guys?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. That was well done.
Lauren, I'm assuming you guys are doing tons of prototyping based on actual ROI measurements targets.
Yes. I think, so as very specific to the design team of Nest, right? Our process is often getting in the trenches with the algorithms team and sort of looking at the problem from both sides at the same time. It's I was actually having a conversation with a colleague recently who's outside of those teams and was like, well, do you think UX can do something and then we can go have a conversation with the algorithms team? And I was like, no. It's not that linear, right? We need both teams in the mix looking at what the potential is and what the opportunities are and what's possible, you know, in the next year or so. So I think those explorations are then fueling other parts of the business to go take it and evaluate it, but we have to get the experiments to a certain point where that conversation can be facilitated.
Yeah, and I think in that process, there's convergent thinking and divergent thinking as well. Like, because the possibilities that Lauren mentioned are so enormous, given, you know, any sort of data set, that you have to have sort of the convergent guardrails of that business or sort of consumer or person human goal involved too, because it can really kind of go all over the place, and you need that. You need those guardrails to understand, like, if you're really making some sort of impact in a person's life.
So Christian, you touched a little bit on like bots, and I want to shift a little bit and talk a little bit more about just the general concept of personalization. And there's, you know, consumers have an expectation now that when they are in any sort of branded experience that knows a decent amount about them and is tailoring the experience and tailoring the content and potentially the products to them. how much are you guys, Verizon, kind of thinking about that? What are some of the pitfalls in kind of discovering those types of things? And also, how are you communicating to the end users that it's something that you're doing in a not so creepy way?
Yeah, I think generally you always have to be wary of that uncanny valley of like, am I talking to a human or am I talking to something that's not human? And the creepiness factor, right? And it's somewhere in between those two where you got to nuance your way into these things. I'll sort of give you a Verizon example of one of the products we've launched with a bot. So if you look at the Verizon Fios team, they went and built a messenger bot. So it sits on Facebook Messenger and allows different services to become available when you log in and your profile is attached. You can go and see when's my bill due. You can go see what's on TV tonight, tomorrow. You can schedule certain things. You can get customer service on it. So I think there's a nuanced approach to thinking about how a brand's relationship with the consumer is today and what those touch points are. So for Fios, for example, it's, what's on tonight? It's, hey, something's broken, how do I get it fixed? It's, what are the things that I want to know about my service call? So there's fun things in there that are pushing the envelope a little further where it opens new doors to possibility. So one of those examples is you can actually just ask the Facebook Messenger bot, hey, where's my tech, right? And you get a pinpoint of where they are on the way. So having a grounding in what your consumer expectations are today and thinking about how you can use some of these new types of interfaces to surprise and delight them is kind of the approach you need to take.
Yeah, I think it's all about the value that you can add as well. So the correlation between the amount of data and sort of that kind of creepiness factor and the value is almost sort of directly related. And in past, I was on the Alexa team, and in early stages of that team, you would ask people if they would like this ambient personal assistant in their home, and they'd look at you like you were crazy until they actually understood the value of that. And that, again, you have to make something tangible. I think that project probably would have never got off the ground if it were just for, do people expect this or do people think it would add value just based on that creepiness factor. And then you add on top of that it's Amazon listening to you as well, and it was just basically a non-starter. So you had to kind of go off basically on, well, what can we do to these people's lives to make this technology actually impactful or even make sense?
Yeah, I mean, you guys, I think you covered it. I think with personalization, so when I'm looking at personalization, I'm looking at personalization to a household, which is actually not a person. It's a collective of a family. It may be other people that help them maintain the household. It may be the person that comes in and installs the products and becomes part of the life cycle of the Nest experience in their home. And I think that's another way to look at it. There's personalization to me as the individual. There's personalization to the context that the product is in, and how does that shape things? Because I don't think we're ever going to get away from two people having a conversation and deciding what is the right thing between the two of them. And our average of their two wants or needs isn't necessarily going to do that. So it becomes a tricky problem of how do you get the right balance where you're still serving them collectively, but not making too many assumptions.
So to you on this one as well, Lauren, which is there's a lot of misconceptions around the level of effort it takes to actually bring into an organization like an AI system, right? And I think, again, some of those misconceptions are really just around, a lot of people don't understand that there's a lot of APIs available out there. To Christian's point, there's a new bot company starting every day. You look at all the different things that Watson has available to it, or all the different things that TensorFlow has available to it, or Intel Saffron, whatever it is, right? So how do you, as an organization, leverage existing technologies across the board? And how can people kind of in this room and watching online even think just about how is it that they should start to embrace these things that previously were thought of as massive server farms in a basement?
Yeah, I mean, so again, maybe I need the asterisks on me. I do have the backing of Google, and there's a lot to leverage there that as an internal partner company within Alphabet, we have access to that. It's not always made public or at the same speed made public. But I think, even just looking back at the last couple of years where technology was, we could have been having this conversation a handful of years ago, and getting a autocomplete on a search field would have been a big deal and a big effort for a company to implement, because there wasn't necessarily as many resources and plugins to pull and to add in. So I think the baseline has graduated, and there's a lot that's now table stakes that a CEO or a CMO or somebody in the business side just assumes will be there, that you have to be creative of where you're going to find that, or is it something that you really need to build yourself?
Yeah, I think the challenge that we have at Microsoft is less about sort of the rational portion of solving problems in terms of technology, but it's the sort of emotional brand experience that sort of AI could bring as well. So how do you make solving a problem either delightful or make it resonate to a group of people in an emotional way as well? Because at this point in a lot of our sectors, people aren't making purchase decisions based on how rationally your product solves a problem, just because that level is basically reached kind of parity across a lot of different products and industries. So how can you use AI and understand an audience well enough to have that AI react to their culture or their context or their specific condition?
I'd say, access to computation is decreasing exponentially, right? Like you can quickly get access to anything in AWS to help you not only store the data that you're collecting as a small startup, but to churn the numbers and come up with an algorithm and fine-tune that algorithm over time. So the hesitation for folks to be able to test, the entry point to get the scale to do that computation is getting lower and lower. Part of it is, okay, what are you doing that for and what's the business justification for it? You can incrementally go and invest in certain things to reinvest over time. So prove this value prop one. Can you get that hero feature done for your brand or for your customer? And can you go and build from there, sort of a momentum builder versus, hey, I'm going to go spin up 1,000 servers somewhere and have that giant farm and the CapEx associated with investing in all of that. It's, hey, what's the thing I need to prove to start getting the ball down the hill? And from there, you can use your momentum because, hey, maybe you might not get it right. And maybe you shouldn't be doing it in that particular way. It's like I said before, it's not, everything isn't a nail. So what's the right thing for you to be attacking? And can you make the intelligent decision up front on the amount of investment you're willing to do based on the value that you think you'll bring into the business?
Can I jump in on the not getting it right? I mean, there is definitely a risk in that, because when you launch something that is AI-based or machine learning-based, the launch is like the beta, right? It takes forever before it's actually up and running at like a massive amount. It's not like launching another feature that's just sort of, the code and it does what you want it to do. So yeah, the risk in like failure is it's money, it's time, but it's also time out in the market of watching if it's doing what you want it to do.
And that the time it takes to train is significantly longer for some of these use cases because you have to get the behavior modeled over time. Right. Where in the past it was, hey, did the button work or did it not work? And when you set expectations internally, you have to say, oh, by the way, this algorithm isn't really going to be fine-tuned until this timeline, and so can't really promise the world. You need to set the right expectations of what the realm of the feasible is for your business first.
Yeah.
So you guys talked about kind of like changes in technology over the years there. I want to think a little bit about like changes in design process, right? I mean, Tim and Lauren, like you guys have been experienced designers for years now, and when you actually think about years ago, people were designing for the desktop, and then mobile came around and everything was designed mobile first. Are we going through a similar evolution now when it comes to being a designer and thinking about how we're actually designing with AI first? as opposed to thinking about the actual platform you're designing on, thinking a little more broadly about kind of like liquid interfaces and things like that. Lauren, you want to start?
Sure. I think that every stage we've seen up till now has created exponential variants, but that are still fully understood. So like, you have to first, like you said, desktop. Then it was desktop and mobile, right? Okay, now the work just sort of doubled, or maybe you get some efficiency somewhere. But both of them are kind of confined spaces, and all the variables. When I'm designing something or when I'm working with my team, every single case, every single possible thing that the person can get into is accounted for. There's a screen, there's copy, there's an icon, there's an error message, whatever there needs to be. With designing algorithms, you go through exhaustive lists of scenarios, but they seem to be infinite. And when you're designing algorithms that then build on top of algorithms, it just becomes exponential, right? So I think it's becoming more about not having this perfectly crafted experience from end to end, but having a really good set of rules and really good set of inputs that you have to monitor over time to see if any of them are reacting as unintended or reacting against something else that's in the system that you didn't anticipate the interplay between. And so it's becoming more about this cause and effect thinking than it is necessarily about this perfectly refined flow and container. I think that's still happening, but in a different work stream.
I think the biggest difference I see is when you're designing for people to adapt to technology, you're using sort of pre-existing patterns in technology. So design libraries, the way software technology works right now in terms of touch, mobile, desktop, even head-mounted displays now. But I think AI flips it, and it's sort of a trend that was already happening, so that you have to understand the person and how the technology is going to adapt to those people, as opposed to the other way around. So this allows us to really kind of take a step back and be even more empathetic, and then also expand the types of people that we're targeting. So at Microsoft, so we have sort of three ranges of social conditions, right? So like race, gender, and so forth. We have cognitive conditions as well. So different people have different ways of learning. So you've got people that learn from example, people that are explorers, and so forth. So there's different cognitive ways to approach problem solving. And then you have, of course, physical abilities or inabilities based on their context as well, which some people equate to accessibility. But you take all these factors in, and that's sort of your sandbox to design in, as opposed to sort of these pre-existing technological constraints.
The canvas is changing, right? Your canvas is no longer just a desktop screen or a mobile screen. It's different modalities like voice, like head-mounted, like AR, right? You in those, they become more individualized, and to your point, unless you know the person, you're gonna miss opportunities to make it much more sticky and emotional to the individual, because it should be dynamic based on who they are and who their needs are.
And it depends if it's a active, interactive AI technology, or if it's a passive, behind-the-scenes AI technology. So the canvases are changing. You may not even have a canvas in some of them, where something goes wrong and there isn't really a way to communicate why it went wrong, and you leave the person maybe stuck in a scenario that they don't know how they got into. So there are a lot of factors, like you're saying.
Yeah, we sort of call it 0D to 2D to 3D. We've been trapped, or not trapped, but we've been focused on 2D for so long, just in terms of touching a glass screen or interacting with it with a mouse. Then you have 3D with head-mounted displays and AR, MR, VR, and so forth. And you have 0D, which is sort of an ambient sensor where you're using voice or gaze or something like that. And that's a whole different set of sort of input modalities that you have to deal with as well.
It's funny. I've got a almost 3-year-old, and he doesn't even know what a newspaper is. He can get to Daniel Tiger's neighborhood on the PBS app faster than I can. And when he feels like dancing, he just says, Alexa, play Zach Brown. And like 2-year-old accent isn't that great, but that's how quickly the way that we're engaging with these interfaces is changing. And so each of those become new generations, new cohorts that have different expectations of interaction with all these different 2D, 3D, 0D scenarios. And all of those represent different ways for brands, products, and experiences to connect with their consumers.
So with that in mind, I mean, we're talking a lot about experiences that brands are delivering to consumers here. I think in the industry, historically, the use of data and the use of predictive analytics and things like that has been thought of much more on kind of like the acquisition side. Like, how am I actually going to target people in a more efficient way using some of these types of systems? What you guys are really touching on is a lot more how are you making more engaging experiences for consumers. So how do companies actually need to think about that when historically they're only used to thinking about the use of data when it comes to targeting, and now actually data being core of kind of like the creative process? Christian?
It's companies trying to think about the entire life cycle with the consumer even before they're a consumer, so as they're part of the acquisition funnel and what they know about that customer before, because these different types of touch points that are emerging aren't just after I've signed up for a service or I've been there for a while. It's, what was the first chatbot viral thing I watched on social, right? All the way to the time I end the service or refer somebody else to it. So if you look at how organizations have been structured over the past couple of decades, it's been, hey, there's a team, there's a sales team, and that sales team goes and finds the customers. There's a product team, and that product team builds the experience, and they're sort of separate. And so I think moving forward, because of AI, the things you can do with data, how you can use that data across our relationships with the customer, you can have a better experience as a consumer because you can blend those two previously siloed buckets. So I'll give you, so the Fios messenger bot, for example, is something that you can engage with before you're a Fios customer, while you're consuming the content, and after when you're traditionally doing things around service. So I even forgot that third bucket of, okay, how do you service the customer? And so companies need to think about data as the sort of unifying glue to start breaking down those previous silos within organizations. And this is a very interesting opportunity space for all companies to start thinking about.
So, I mean, to chime in on that before Tim and Lauren go, I mean, you're making a pretty big assumption there, which is that organizations work efficiently and collaboratively.
They don't all just...
And I think a lot of people in this room can probably attest that there might be a coworker sitting in a desk 5 feet from them, but for X reason, they have no interest in sharing data. So like, Tim, how are you guys getting around things like that?
Yeah, I think it's all about thinking more holistically. I mean, Microsoft is a very established company, and so sort of there are a ton of silos that previously worked quite efficiently and now need to be basically stripped and broken apart. And then there's a ton of tenure in terms of people that work at Microsoft. So there's culture involved with that as well. And I've just joined, so I'm seeing how that culture and sort of those organizational silos are breaking apart. And it's really interesting. There's a huge opportunity to understand how people are considering all the time. So it's not just the marketing department's job to create sort of a consideration phase and then pass it off to someone that's going to kind of take it further down into the funnel, like you were mentioning. So everyone now is thinking about consideration, because at any time, the next new service or product, especially in terms of AI, could just sort of steal, whatever point in time that your customer is on that purchase path.
Yeah, I would agree. I think we may see a real shift in organizational design. So there's the chance people are holding on to stuff separate in their corners of the company, but there's also the chance that somebody wants something and they just don't know somebody else has it. And if those two people could find each other, they actually wouldn't mind sharing it. It's free data for them in that particular company culture, you know. But I think that the companies have to start thinking about what teams need to talk most closely to each other, what teams need to be encouraged to be collaborative, and how do we set up our companies to do that. And that might not be what worked 10 years ago. That might be a whole new model where marketing and product aren't, you know, on the opposite ends of things, but are sitting next to each other and closing that loop.
So the last thing I want to talk about before we open it up to a couple questions is ethics and biases. So you know, everybody inherently has some biases, and I think as designers and engineers and developers, how do you guys even think about making sure those biases don't come across in the designs that you're making for everyday consumers? Tim, you want to start with this one?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm very privileged at Microsoft to have the inclusive design team report into me. So it's a whole team that's dedicated to understanding, celebrating, and incorporating sort of the whole breadth of human diversity in how we design our products. So it's sort of, if you think about accessibility and compliance as sort of minimum bar, we're using inclusive design to create opportunities to innovate based on people that are excluded. And the first step in doing that is to just recognize exclusion. So we have you know, a ton of research and a ton of toolkits around the company, and it's also sort of open source on the web if you search for Inclusive Design Microsoft. That allows us to understand who we're targeting, but at the same time, there's just as much effort in understanding who we're excluding, because you're always excluding someone. So in the case of something like an automotive experience, where you know, you may be excluding people that have low vision or blind people, we've actually turned to blind people to understand how they process information in terms of chat, in terms of text, in terms of email, and that's really sort of superpowered our experience in terms of people who are situationally blind in a car where you can't look at a screen. So we call that solve for one and extend to many. So exclusion is actually a way to invent.
So totally agree, and I think the sort of sometimes thought as edge cases can spur the creativity that the masses might not be thinking about on a day-to-day basis. And so within Open Innovation, we go and fund and partner with a number of universities, and the ones that I get most excited about are the ones that are around abilities. And so Cornell Tech, we work with Cornell Tech in New York and have a connected experience lab that's looking at how do you go and help for some of these scenarios, things like wayfinding through haptics and wearables, things like vision impairment and identifying objects so you can go shopping during the day when you previously couldn't. And so in those scenarios, those are sort of the tip of the spear when it comes to solving human ability opportunities, and can start to really bleed into some of the things you think from a mass market perspective down the road.
We again, this sort of goes back to the fact that we're designing for a collective of people. We have to often take into account, you know, the purchaser is not the user, is not the person that has to come in and learn the device cold because they've never experienced it before. And so part of our process is actually pushing past who maybe is most likely to buy the product and actually looking at all the people who are likely to touch the product and to what level they're going to come into contact with the product with prior experience. So we talk a lot about, you know, like the maintenance worker that you've let into the house on their own and they need to go adjust something, or the caretaker that might be spending a large amount of time in the house. And I think because of that, it forces us to realize that we can't make too many assumptions about the user or the customer or the, you know, whoever that person is. We have to keep enough tolerance and openness in what we're doing that allows for variance and things we're not going to anticipate and differences in all those people that are part of our ecosystem. I think The diversity piece, though, is awesome, and you make me wonder how we can get more of that into our process as well.
Well, Tim said it was open source. So
Yeah, I know. I'm gonna go read it up on it.
Except for Google.
So does anybody have any questions from the audience? I think we might have time for 2 or 3 questions. Start over here.
It seems to me that ultimately what you're doing all is creating the perfect parent. Actually, quite specifically, the perfect parent for the infant. Anticipating needs, needing them before they're even expressed. What effect, when that hits everybody, what effect do you think that's going to have on us socially?
So to reiterate the question, just so everybody can hear, it was around it. Are we using and designing to some of these systems to kind of create the perfect parent for the masses, essentially? And what effect will that have?
I think, so one of the things we've been looking at, there's been a couple of studies on the family dynamic, right, in the US. And so it's almost as if we're in almost a post-household America, where the traditional family of 30 or 40 years ago no longer exists. And you can use the sort of scenarios around password sharing for accounts and who consumes certain digital goods and where do they actually physically sit and what's the structure of that family. And so from a social dynamic perspective, I think it's important for all of us to think about how those relationships are inherently changing with technology now, and to make sure that there's a balance between past relationships and how social networks were created physically and within proximity, and think about how some of those relationships have changed to date, right? I don't have to be physically in the same place or be a blood relative to have a deeper relationship as I might have 20 years ago, but to also make sure that that continues in the future. So it's not just me talking to my bot, and it's kind of a sad state of affairs. So keeping the human-to-human relationship going and spurred through some of these scenarios, and really the way to do it is to continue to study and understand human behavior and things like partnering with anthropology schools to understand how that's changed over time can inform a lot of the technology decisions that we make as companies.
I think the effect it will have is that expectations will dramatically change. Even to this right now, I have little cousins, nieces, nephews that expect the environment to change wherever they're at because it changes in their household via Alexa, or it could be OK Google or whatever. So they're in the car and they want music. So Alexa, play whatever, bus song. Or turn down the lights, or tell me a joke, and when that doesn't happen, they're disappointed. So that expectation is there, but it also allows them to focus on other things as well. So I think just expectations are going to increase dramatically.
I think there's also the idea of people's reliance on technology has completely changed over the last couple of years, and probably to a degree to a fault. And I think the irony of a bunch of people who are in technology kind of talking about these things is, I personally think that you see a resurgence of people who are quitting Facebook for a month, or taking a break from Twitter, or not using certain technology when their kids are around, because I think people are shifting in the way some of the social dynamics and the reliance on technology just to such an extreme degree that some of the stuff we don't need. I mean, I think all of our parents were fine before Uber, but guess what? We all use Uber and Lyft multiple times a day, and the world was totally cool before seamless. You went downstairs to pick up that pizza, and that's okay. So I think our reliance on all of these things is getting to a point where the value exchange between these services and us is just inherent into everything we do, and now people are starting to not backlash towards it, but at least wanting to say we don't always need to rely on technology so in such an extreme way. It doesn't need to be our parents all the time.
First of all, thank you. This has been fascinating. I love this panel. I have a question. You brought up headsets. I work in both VR and AR. As a developer and distributor of VR and AR content, I don't mean just gaming,
Definitely. I mean, I think AI is just another tool. And if you're trying to create sort of an immersive environment, and then also if you're trying to create something that can be sort of personalized or anticipate whoever's needs are wearing the head-mounted display or whatever, I think it could come in handy, definitely. I mean, because it's sensory based as well. So I mean, when you're dealing with AR and MR and VR, you have gaze, you have voice. It's such a natural experience, or it should be. And AI can add to that feeling of it being more natural, as opposed to it sometimes sort of it can make you sick as well.
Talk to my engineers. We argue about this.
So we might have time for one more question if anybody has anything. So just so everybody here, so different tools and platforms that you guys are using to kind of design for multi-AI driven systems.
I'm going to tweak it a little bit because I was thinking about this from almost a network perspective. So, previously you had applications be developed for particular screens or OSs or destinations within time and attention of our users. So I'm going to build something for mobile. I'm going to build something for desktop. I'm going to build something for a back-end application. I think looking forward, thinking about the distribution of that computation and application development across all those different nodes in a network, from the server all the way to the edge, and the ability for distributed networks to continue to start building efficiencies, better performance, new capabilities and decisioning across that network. That would be an interesting area for people to build developer tools around. So AI layered on top of a network from the server all the way down to the edge, things like distributed networks, blockchain, to throw out another buzzword, to start enabling all those different interplays, and applications being built on top of those so that you can extend an application experience into not just one particular screen or device, but across devices and modalities, from the physical touchscreens that we've got to the MR, VR, AR scenarios, to voice and everything in between.
I think part of your question is that there are multiple technology revolutions going on at the same time. And each of those factors is causing creators of any sort, whether it's engineer, design, even from the business side of the equation, to think about what they need to communicate their idea. And we're seeing a period of time where those tools are a lot of homemade tools. There are a lot of tools that are way back in somebody's toolkit that they've pulled out and said, what if I try to communicate it this way? We do a lot of script writing. There are certain parts of our interface, especially on the Nest Protect, that's all written out in, it says this, then it says this, then it does this, then it says this. There's not that, at times, not that much visual to show, but we need to communicate it conversationally or through other mediums. So I think it's exploratory. I don't think there's like a tool out there. I think people are probably creating the tools right now.
And I also think that the talent that is doing this type of work is evolving, and I think as somebody who looks at portfolios and resumes and things like that of designers, it's like gone are the days where you have an expectation that somebody's going to show you a 40-page experience design deck for a website or for a chat experience. I think the expectation is that they're actually showing you a prototype of some sort that they've created, and I think because of that, the entire industry is changing how they judge, process, and work, I think.
And I would just say film is another medium that's great. And you talked about script writing. We're hiring screenwriters and copywriters and so forth just to establish scenarios and sell scenarios as well. And then another sort of tool is what we're working on at Microsoft. It's called Fluent Design System, which is sole purpose is to sort of take on the challenge of multi-device, multi-input modality, and sort of this whole notion towards creativity that everyone has right now as well. So you could take a look at that as too. I don't know if it's open source, but it's available. You can check it out. We should open source it.
Can you see I'm making a list?
Well, I think we're getting kicked out, but we're all going to be kind of kicking around here for a little bit, I think. So if people have other questions, we're all relatively friendly, so feel free to come up to us. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, everybody.